And don't forget... what was I going to... Sorry.
Don't forget
And yet I
the
have...
silly way we met.
This time we watched Season 6, Episode 10, The Violent Years.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Violence.
But first, hey, it's our 50th episode.
Hey, oh my God, this should be a full celebration. We can finally read off the results for that poll that we did.
We already did that, Adam.
Oh, then we have nothing to celebrate.
I think we do. Because we are now a podcast that is officially long in the tooth, I think we can give some time to promoting some new up-and-coming megaphonic podcasts, including yours, a part of our Scaritage, which is really going strong right now.
Hooray, yes. I started that with my friend Sarah, my co-host, back in October. And for those who haven't listened, and for shame if that's you, listener, it's just a look at the weirdness of CanCon horror. We've looked at a bunch, such as Ginger Snaps, that people will know, and The Gate, which seems to be one of the more popular episodes that we've done, but also more obscure fare like Bob Clark's Death Dream and such. It's a lot of fun to do, and we've got a few surprises coming up. If you would like to download any episodes of a part of our Scaritage, you can find it at megaphonic.fm/scare.
It's funny because I was just listening to an episode of Stop Podcasting Yourself, and those dudes are from Vancouver, I think. And they were mentioning that when you're a Canadian, you just get kind of an instinct for, I think this is Canadian.
Yeah, it looks cheap.
Exactly.
It looks cheap.
There's just a strange, like an endearing cheapness about the production of anything that was made in Canada.
And sometimes not so endearing. Sometimes it's just flat out ineptitude, either because the money was given to the wrong hands or not enough money was given to the right hands to make a coherent feature.
I think that's a good point, and I think that's what adds to what is really interesting about horror movies especially, is Canada doesn't really have a professional filmmaking class, really, I would say, like an industry. Everybody's just kind of, doing what they can. So there's a real originality to a lot of these horror movies.
Yeah, there's a lot of indie artists who are trying to basically break into the scene. I mean, one of the directors was George Mihalka, who directed if you see one Halifax slasher movie in your life, be sure it's the original My Bloody Valentine, described the third Canadian city as Los Angeles, since everyone just had their eyes on leaving. That's why you made a movie. You made a movie to get out of the Canadian system. And it's fun looking at that, whether we're talking about tax shelter movies on the program, whether we're talking about things that were made by a more established person in the industry. Like we looked at a Ivan Reitman horror movie they did with Eugene Levy and Andrea Martin called Cannibal Girls. I always thought that was his first movie. And no, he had been making softcore flicks. That's how he made it. It's funny. It's been really interesting. We've seen some micro budget stuff. We've got some exciting things. One of our most recent episodes was on Pin, which was about an evil doll, which featured Lost's Terry O'Quinn and Breaking Bad's Mike Ehrmantraut, Jonathan Banks himself, as the voice of a killer doll. And we're doing very soon the Trapped in a Cube movie, Cube.
I've seen that one, yes.
Yes, I just finished editing that. And following that, we're finally breaking our Cronenberg cherry. And we're tackling him on the program. I feel he would approve of such a messy image.
I am definitely going to check those out. Those are movies I have seen.
Yes. Well, how fond are you of Cube? Because we weren't that fond of it.
It's funny. My now husband introduced that to me very early on, and I found it unpleasant.
Yeah, was he skunked out on bad weed when he saw it? Because every stoner thinks it's very profound. When you watch it, it's quite shallow.
I think he found it like a cerebral kind of engagement with the idea of, I don't know. I thought it was crap.
Spoiler, it's not great. It's the first really bad movie we've had to talk about, barring maybe Cannibal Girls.
Well, on that note, should we get to our feature?
I suppose so. Let's cause some crimes and talk about electric things.
Hey everybody, producer Chris here, just popping in to let you know that this episode contains a discussion of the sexual violence that happens in the movie. If you're not in the mood to listen to that right now, you can skip between about 20 minutes in to 35 minutes in when the Shell 13 starts up again. And if your podcast app supports chapters, it should be pretty easy to skip ahead. Just wanted to let you know. Enjoy the episode.
And now, Season 6, Episode 10, The Violent Years.
But first, a short called A Young Man's Fancy. Judy, a bacon-loving, boy-crazy teen, yearns for the touch of her older brother's closest friend, Alex. Tragically, Judy can't read between the lines when her brother Bob assures her that Alex has no interest in girls, and would much rather shower and shave with him. Furthermore, Judy can't take a hint when Alex turns down her advances in favor of a late-night meeting with an older man. But it's the 50s, damn it, and Alex is going to need a beard, so he and Judy work out an arrangement. She'll cook the meals, and he'll tell her about all the latest household appliances available from a store near you. Their pending nuptials likely won't survive the Bobby Orr electric marriage kit from Are You Ready for Marriage? The end.
And now for our feature presentation. Paula Perkins is a poor little rich girl, her pleas ignored by her amiable mother and doting father because they engage in reprehensible things like work and charity. She takes out her feelings of neglect by leading a group of similar teen girl ne'er-do-wells. First, they rob a series of gas stations, and then terrorize a couple on Lover's Lane. Paula's dad is a newspaperman, so she quickly finds out that the police are putting undercover officers at gas stations. Their usual source of money and kicks erased, she instead follows a tip from her fence, Sheila, wrecks some classrooms, and makes sure to destroy the American flag in the process. This plan is apparently being funded by the Russians as a means to sabotage American democracy. Full disclosure, this plot seems less ridiculous now than it did when this episode first aired in the 90s. Paula celebrates by having a makeout party with her friends for her birthday. When her father's reporter buddy shows up, Paula reveals the source of her ruin. Her parents never came to her birthdays, buying her new watches and cars instead. I think this is how Ted Bundy got started. Anyway, the girls successfully wreck the school, but things escalate precipitously when the cops show up and start shooting. 2 girls go down, as well as 1 policeman, but the remaining 2 girls manage to escape. When Paula shows up at Sheila's house to collect her vandalism-cum-murder wages, Sheila very loudly announces she's going to call the cops. And so naturally, Paula shoots her. But Paula's now in a downhill spiral. The police recognize her, and after a brief car chase, Paula crashes into a storefront, injuring herself and killing her last accomplice. Paula is found guilty of murder and is sentenced to life in prison. After the judge reams in on them for a good, 10 minutes of screen time, the parents prostrate themselves to the camera over the mistakes they made in parenting. Oh, and Paula's pregnant and she dies in childbirth. Her parents want to make amends by raising their grandchild right, which gives the judge another opportunity to moralize unendingly before refusing their request for custody. The movie ends with the cries of an infant ward of the state. Fun!
Meanwhile, on the Satellite of Love, Tom shows the gang his new look. He's traded his cute bubblegum dome and beak for a hideous doll head. Given the terror on display, I'd say the Child's Play reboot would have benefited from casting Kevin Murphy instead of Mark Hamill as Chucky. In Deep 13, Dr. Forrester and Frank perform a lovely duet that's a strong contender for the series' best song.
Bada bean, we're living in Deep 13. Nobody knows what we mean.
This is apparently Dr. Forrester's theme music, more on that later. And so, the boys in Deep 13 task the SOL crew with making their own themes. Tom has a self-aggrandizing number set to the tune of Carmina Burana, and Crow hastily cobbles together themes for himself and Mike that consist of repeating their names over and over again. After the failure of the theme song bit, which did not guarantee world domination after all, the Mad start a radio station named Frank.
A radio station called Frank?
That's right, so come on, turn your crank to Frank!
Which promises more Winona. Mike and the bots are skeptical if they need any more. Our next pair of sketches revolve around celebrity impressions. Tom reenacts a scene from the then latest version of A Star is Born, starring Barbra Streisand, where he wails incoherently for a while in a sketch that can be almost described as a joke. Later, Mike storms off during Crow's one-man show as Keanu Reeves. In the epilogue, Crow and Mike recreate the final holdup from the film by staring blankly at each other for over a minute. Meanwhile, Tom and Gypsy read a letter. The SOL crew are invited to a high school graduation commencement at Bakersfield High School. Bakersfield's slogan is once a driller, always a driller. Weird. Back in Deep 13, Dr. F and Frank continue to extol the virtues of a radio station called Frank. Beth, did this tickle your young man's fancy?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought Young Man's Fancy was so much fun. The shorts in this era are pure gold in my estimation. Most of the segments, most of the host segments were really funny. The Keanu Reeves one was terrible, but I'm even a fan of the Esther Hoffman Howard one. I think Kevin Murphy does an amazing job there. And the riffing is good throughout. This is an Ed Wood movie, which can sometimes be difficult, but I thought it was spry and well-paced enough that I didn't get extremely bored watching it, and the riffing was super good. Yeah, thumbs up.
I feel like I went to the store. This is my experience for this episode, if I metaphor, to buy Party Mix. And what I got, I didn't get any of those delicious Doritos that I like. No Cheetos. It was just black licorice.
Oh, boy.
I could not really remember much of the episode after I'd watched it. I didn't get much out of the short either. I had kind of a similar experience. And I was really looking forward to an Ed Wood film. And I'd kind of forgotten this episode. I know I'd seen it a while ago because I was very familiar with the theme song bit. And it lacks a lot of the kookiness that I associate with Ed Wood. So the fun threatens to come out, but it never did. And a lot of the riffing for me just didn't have the kind of variety I would expect. It was pleasant enough. Like here, I didn't enjoy the sketches either, save for that one.
Which one? The After Hoffman Howard one?
No. The theme song sketch. Specifically, Dr. Forrester's theme, which is one of the best songs of the whole show. I've had that stuck in my head ever since. It's a great theme, and it's a great use of Dr. F and Frank, who are stretched out with some real thin material otherwise.
I had actually forgotten about the epilogue where Mike and Crow are recreating the gun robbery scene from the movie, and I thought it was hilarious. I really did. They're just standing there, and it just captures that moment of almost tension in the movie, but extends the weirdness of it. So you see, like, that was a very strange choice, just to have the gas attendant kind of hunch over staring for like a good 5 minutes of screen time.
And yet, had Ed Wood been behind the camera, as well as behind the typewriter, that would have been a million times weirder, and thus worth celebrating. But I will say, that letter was super sweet, which was a nice note for the show to end on, for that particular episode to end on, I should say, because it's nice, the idea that Mike and the Bonds might potentially visit your high school, although in reality, that would probably be quite creepy, like having John Kay show up at your dance.
Maybe not that bad. But maybe we should move on to our next topic, since you brought it up. Ed Wood Jr.
Yes, Edward D. Wood Jr., the greatest Wood of them all.
I can't believe this is the first one we've done, and it feels like we've done one before, but I guess our super accurate producer Chris says this is our first. And I agree with you that this almost doesn't feel like an Ed Wood Jr. movie, because it feels like a journeyman's picture, right? Like, it's not terrible, it's not good, it's just acceptable.
Yeah, that's the trouble with it. To think, after all this time, it's been over 2 years, and we finally got Wood, but it's barely a proper, full-throttled Wood that one would expect, because the creativity of Ed Wood, which is why I think he is mislabeled as the worst filmmaker of all time, and why he is in fact so celebrated, is that there's a weird personal vision in most of his work that makes it really compelling and, to this day, unique.
Yeah, like, you can tell the script is very Woody, but I do miss his direction.
Yes, and that's really where I think joie de vivre of Ed Wood comes through. And I guess this finds us straight in the middle of Wood's two periods, because we have the creative madness of the Wood and Lugosi days, and the later, sadder Ed Wood years, where he became a peddler of smut and made, I wouldn't call them nudie cuties, but I don't know, topless features. I don't know how best to describe them. They're best not seen. They lack a lot of the charms, because in the latter days of his career, Ed Wood, and you're not going to see this if you watch the movie Ed Wood, which in some ways is a blessing, just became a penniless alcoholic who was mad and sad all the time and constantly owed people money, and was more or less a figure of ridicule for that entire time. And naturally it would have went to his head, which is unfortunate, because damn it, there's something to him. There is something really special about the early Ed Wood features, and we get one of his finest hours when they tackled Bride the Monster in season 4, just because that is delightful and strange. And they perhaps wisely never tackled Plan 9 from Outer Space, because it was just too well known and too familiar. You end up kind of competing with people's memories of seeing it for the first time and riffing it with friends, and that would potentially, I think, make for a disastrous episode.
My favorite Ed Wood movie is The Sinister Urge, which I feel like is kind of this movie's twin in a lot of ways. It hits a lot of the same points, but has the delightful Ed Wood ridiculousness to it that this one is kind of lacking.
And I can't help but wonder if the sleaze is something that Wood chased after, or was something that was kind of imposed on him to make money. Because when you look at the earlier stuff, when you look at Glen or Glenda, I wouldn't exactly call that sleazy. It's very earnest. It's very heartfelt. And obviously that goes with him seeing himself as kind of a Christine Jorgensen figure, even though he is not transgender and was not thinking that way from everything that we know about him. He equated that with his own struggle, with his desire to wear Angora sweaters, and so made it a very personal story, and he took over that story so that it would be about an Ed Wood type guy. But it's still a really loving plea for tolerance amidst all of its weird outsider art. Ed Wood is the cinematic equivalent of the Shags, in that everything is wrong, but it adds up to something so beautiful and unique.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah, you seem to be suggesting that maybe he was a reluctant sleaze peddler. And it's true that in both Sinister Urge and Bride of the Monster, there's so much sympathy for the outsiders. So it seems like even though he has to toe a specific line, the very colorful characters are the ones that were supposed to be the villains, really.
Yes, and it's always the eccentrics and the oddballs that Wood's sympathies were always with. And I mean, it doesn't really take much to connect the dots there. There's a lot of, I think, empathizing and yearning for understanding, and it's fun to see, at the very least, when the women in his life were interviewed much later after his passing and his films were rediscovered. When, say, Kathy Wood or his girlfriend, who is portrayed in the movie by Sarah Jessica Parker, Dolores, they are happy that they knew him, and they did love him and were attracted to him. And surprisingly, the way that they relate their experiences with Ed Wood's desire for cross-dressing and wearing their clothes was one of curiosity and support, rather than any kind of disdain. Maybe that's the benefit of hindsight too, as of course they were interviewed in the 80s and 90s, but they still seem to hold a soft spot for the guy. And with everything that I'd read and seen with them, is that they seem to hold it as kind of a tragedy that he just couldn't get it together and he died a penniless drunk.
Everybody kind of lost their way in the 60s. It was a bad decade for a lot of indie filmmakers.
Yeah, if you were a Poverty Row filmmaker and you had the reputation of making at least one of the worst movies of all time, it was not so hot for finding work. And it's a damn shame, because I don't necessarily think that greater respect or budgets would have helped Ed Wood realize his films any better. If anything, I would hope and this is just a thought experiment, that giving him more money and more resources would just result in more colorful and crazy oddness. You would just get films that were off kilter, but now they're expensive.
I have a thought experiment too. I wonder if so many filmmakers like Ed Wood, really fell apart in the 60s because the restrictions put on movies like the Hays Code were just gone. Now you can do outright porn and boobies and things like that. And there's something to the sense of like having lost those restrictions takes away your creativity and just it makes you kind of a sleaze schlocker. And that kind of takes you down,
I wonder if Wood was chasing that or if it was imposed on him. Because it seems like once you get into the nudie era of Ed Wood, the passion's gone. He's making movies for the sake of it. Even a movie like Orgy of the Dead, which stars Criswell and thus should be a delight, is just abominable and hard to watch. And Beth, I like nude women, and I love Criswell. But god damn it, is that movie boring as hell.
Well, why don't we talk about the move into sleaze? I love the title for the segment that our producer Chris gave it. Wait, is this porn?
I think that's a question we ended up asking ourselves a lot last episode.
Right. I say hard no. I mean, it's certainly baiting with...
Baiting.
Yeah, but it's not. It doesn't go far, and like it does that very 50s thing of being exploitative and giving you a little bit of a rise by seeing a bunch of girls acting bad. But it's not all that sexual. Like they have the one scene where they're making out in PJs, but their pajamas are just so sacky that I don't see how it's supposed to be titillating. And unless you really get a rise from girls acting badly, I don't know how this can be really titillating.
Well, don't kick shame, Beth. For shame.
For shame on me, yes.
But no, I hear you with Ed Wood. One of the things that I think ties, I guess, these two topics together is that I think that Ed Wood, because he had such a kind of idea of femininity and how he could embody it and thus write it as well, that he writes these juicy, weird parts for maybe not all of these ladies, but certainly for our lead.
Oh, the brunette too.
Yeah,
when she wants to kill her teacher. That's amazing.
Like these are bizarre, but nonetheless, like fully realized in a way characters. Like they're given a lot to them so that they are interesting. And I think Ed Wood had fun writing them, but had fun writing them as characters that he liked rather than as potential figures for viewers' imaginations to paw at in their dreams. Like I think that we have more of a sense that this is a fun crime movie, but Ed Wood doesn't want to write about mobsters, and Ed Wood doesn't want to write about male juvenile delinquents. He wants to have the roles reversed so that you have a girl gang, and you also have a girl gang who take sexual advantage of a guy. And I think that scene solely exists to be like, I can write a scene like this. I can write a scene where the tables are turned. I don't know if that scene is supposed to be titillating or not because we have Ed Wood as realized from a guy who could barely frame a shot.
I think you've got the right reading. I think these girls are so flinty and hard that I think Ed Wood was playing with that kind of role reversal. So it makes sense to have like a scene where they take advantage of a victim sexually. So the not in disguise, which I thought was a weird choice, the gang not in disguise come across a pair of lovers in a car, and they tie up the woman, and then they take the man into the bushes and have their way with him sexually. Which it was a weird scene because it's the woman who gets kind of stripped down. Her clothes get torn off. Like there's some bondage stuff going on with the woman. But they're not interested in her sexually. Instead, they have this really weird moment where Paula just starts to lift up her shirt which I don't know how that would work exactly in a situation like that. But yeah, there's highly suggested that she's about to push herself sexually onto this man that they are holding hostage, basically.
Yeah, the $11 he had was not enough. They decided to go one further. And I don't know if this is supposed to read like seduction in the script. Again, the intentions are kind of muddied because we don't have that pure wood. And it's a crying shame.
But the reaction to this scene was really weird. And even when I saw it in the 90s, it caused me a lot of like, even as a teenager, like if this was the other way, they would obviously not be really enthusiastic about it. And it's probably the most excited they've ever gotten for a movie.
Yeah, it's a bit yikes. It's a little bit yikes in the theater. I don't think it's malicious. I mean, at the very least, we can write that off. Mm-hmm. But the reaction is bizarre and goes with, I think, a very old comedy idea that a woman raping a man is not just good luck masquerading as a bad thing, but also an impossible thing that you would dream of. Mm-hmm. Because that was even the premise of an Adam Sandler comedy that came out 6 or 7 years ago. Like that's very, very recent. That was a big studio comedy. It is interesting that it is the girlfriend of the victim who is tied up and stripped, although she is wearing a house coat that is less revealing than what I have on right now. So whether or not that would have read as more titillating in the 50s, I can't really be, or the 60s, I can't really be sure.
Well, it's fascinating because it's like it's almost unimaginable that they would strip a man besides taking off his jacket. So they have her as kind of the fill-in for that erotic charge.
Yeah.
They've transferred on. So it's an interesting scene, but like as soon as Paula starts lifting up her shirt, Tom Sawyer was like, "What a great movie!" Mm-hmm. And like there's just all these jokes about how happy the man is. He refuses to press charges, says thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, because obviously they have fulfilled a deep sexual urge that most men never get to actually have fulfilled. So that is where a lot of us go, huh? But I think it's also just, a sign of the times. Like even a show as drecky as South Park pointed out this double standard, when female teachers take advantage of boys, the reaction from everyone is nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is a generational thing. Like this is the sort of thing that I think was joked about in your National Lampoons and even, adult magazines like Playboy and Penthouse and whatnot. The idea that you are just dying as a man to be sexually assaulted by a beautiful woman. That's like a kind of perfect fantasy in a way. It's almost as though you don't have to do any sort of work to have someone essentially seduce you. And it's funny is that's how Mike and the Bots are playing off of the scene. Mm-hmm. That this is a fantasy come true. And I really do think that Ed Wood is more interested in the role reversal. Right. Because you have, what's interesting is that the girlfriend who's stripped down, that's just a humiliation. Mm-hmm. And we don't linger on that. And and even with the man who is there, it's not even necessarily about him as torture either. It's just it's almost just a sign of not only is this like a brazen abuse of power on their part so that we can earn our moralistic ending, but it's also I think Ed Wood is just simply this is fun as a role reversal. This is just escapism in a way. But it's funny how that is a lot more palatable than jokes about it as a reality.
Well, it reminds you how drecky things were for women in the 90s and men for that matter, because feminism was still kind of villainized, even though it was becoming, a little bit more visible. But those dynamics that feminism deals with, which is basically power structures and hierarchy, and how, it's always bad if somebody who is in a position of power takes advantage of someone underneath them or, vulnerable sexually. Doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. It's not cute when a teacher does it with a student. It doesn't matter even if they're both adults. There's still a hierarchy of power there that's being taken advantage of. And so that opened up the door to understand that like young boys are being taken advantage of because they are in a vulnerable position, and took away that idea that men are always in a dominant position even when they're very young. Like, it's impossible for a man to be vulnerable sexually, really. But you can see that Ed Wood actually has more insight. He's just like, this is about humiliation. It's not about seduction. And so for that reason, it's bad.
Yeah, Paula's just wielding power, and she's doing it in a way that must have seemed really scandalous, unless there's a lot of movies with scenes like this that I'm unaware of from the same period.
And they kind of got in on that when they made the Deliverance joke, but they're calling him a pretty boy. Like, they're actually intending to belittle and humiliate him sexually.
This is very much just taking advantage and making sure that he is submissive and belittled by them. And that's one of the reasons why, like, the scene itself is quite interesting in the movie as part of the story and as something existing in its own time, whereas the riffs in the theater are an arcane relic of the 1990s.
Well, I can see, like, it's a very common kink for men to be erotically charged by being in that idea of a submissive position. Otherwise, how do you have dominatrixes, right? But I think that's like the subtlety that people miss. And one of my favorite movies about this is Belle de Jour. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, a long time ago on the Showcase Review.
With Catherine Deneuve. And there's this moment where this sex worker is being a dominatrix and belittling this guy, demeaning him. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry, mistress. I'm so sorry. And then she does something wrong. He's like, no, I want you to do it like this. And they stop their roles for a minute. And he's like, no, do it like this. And then she's like, okay. And then they move back into it. Like, just the reminder, like, no, he's actually the one in charge. And that's why it's a fantasy.
Yeah, any understanding of BDSM comes to the fact that it's always the submissive person who is really in control. I mean, that's why people have rape fantasies, whereas they don't desire to be sexually assaulted.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, weirdly enough, this moment made me respect Ed Wood even more because he seems to be keying in on these subtleties.
Yeah, Ed Wood's a visionary for our time.
Hey, do you guys have any thoughts about how the baby ties into all this?
I don't want to think about baby and Ty in the same sentence after this movie. Woof.
I guess you could say something about how it refeminizes her at the end, because even though she was dominant in impregnating herself, I guess.
Well, this raises another question, and again, this is why it's a damn tragedy that Ed Wood's credit is strictly writing here, because is this? And I think it is, but is this just a bone thrown for audiences so that we can get this movie out there in the first place? That this take charge bad girl is punished with both death, but death through childbirth, so it's a rebirth in a way. It's a rebirth as an innocent after a long moralizing sermon by a judge. That we only have that because the film could get made rather than any kind of statement about her actions or her character.
Yeah, I guess the baby is a way to take this woman who was acting very manly and in charge. And actually, I'll give the actress credit for this. Like, she's hard as flint through this whole movie. Like, she looks like she would actually cut you without ever thinking about it, you know? And then in the end, her female body betrays her, turns her into this vulnerable body that, as so often women do, dies in childbirth, punishing her for trying to get away from her own body and her femininity. And so it's ultimately her body here takes her down. And so I almost kind of appreciate that moment in the end where, like, she's like, I don't want my baby to be born here, which is a very, like, that is the softest thing she ever says in this whole movie. But then she's like, so what? And I actually felt that was kind of a triumph of her character then.
I want if the kind of horror / punishment of pregnancy. It's like horror, punishment, and redemption all in one. It really should have ended with the baby being born as a prototype of the chest bursting scene from Alien.
Mm-hmm. It was weird in that moment where you would expect her to finally give in to her biology and be like, I can't, maybe my baby will have a better life than I did, something like that. Just that kind of motherly renunciation.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't happen. She's so what? Which, we just have to interpret as Ed Wood's 50s way of saying all of this.
Yeah. And I think with the somewhat subversive intentions in the screenplay, let me ask you this. Could you not see this exact same script being done by John Waters with Divine in the lead role? Without changing a word, without changing a scene.
Oh, that would be amazing.
But it feels right, doesn't it? It feels like that's a thing that could have happened. Mm-hmm. That this feels like a script that John Waters would have written influenced by Ed Wood rather than an Ed Wood original script. And I think that's very telling.
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
It's time for the Shallow 13. 13 tiny tidbits about young man's fancy, the violent years, and this episode of MST3K. Go Adam, go!
While the dialogue of the violent years has the Ed Woodenness viewers expect, you may also recognize the musical stylings of composer Michael Terr. Terr scored notable misted B-movies Bloodlust, King Dinosaur, The Unearthly, and Ed Wood's The Sinister Urge. But even if you recognize the style, his name might not be as familiar. Michael Terr was usually credited as Misha Terr or Manuel Francisco.
Gene Moorhead, who plays the pistol-packing Paula Parkins, had appeared on the show way back in Season 3 in a smaller yet more revealing role. Moorhead played the role of a lifetime as Woman in Bathtub for Burt I. Gordon's The Amazing Colossal Man. Both The Violent Years and The Amazing Colossal Man were cashing in on the heat that Moorhead had created when she was in the October 1955 Playboy magazine as Playmate of the Month.
Mike notes that two characters out to enjoy some necking are parked under the RKO logo. RKO Pictures began its life as a film studio in the late 20s and kept its doors open until 1957. Despite its comparatively short run to the other major studios, RKO released the original King Kong, the Astaire Rogers musicals of the 30s, the horror films of Val Lewton, and much of Howard Hawks' best work. The studio's iconic logo consisted of a giant radio transmitter that towered over the rotating Earth.
Tom's Bewigged Freakout sketch references the then most famous version of A Star is Born, starring Barbra Streisand. Though currently overshadowed by the even more famous remake starring Lady Gaga, the Streisand vehicle was neither the original version of the story nor its first remake. The original A Star is Born was released in 1937 and starred Janet Gaynor and was first remade in 1954 with Judy Garland in the lead.
Many critics dismissed the Streisand version as a mess, calling it A Star is Boring, thanks Gene Shalit, and blaming the megalomaniac fingerprints of Barbra Streisand and her producer boyfriend, John Peters, for creating an obsequiously reverential treatment of her character, Esther Hoffman Howard. But Tom is parodying the final scene, which consists of one unbroken shot of Babs singing her heart out for 8 minutes, which has become iconic. Even Roger Ebert conceded, I forgave her everything when she sang.
Ever wonder what Mike and Tom meant with that Say See Sue riff?
Hey. See Sue.
It's a reference to a running gag on the Jack Benny program. Benny would run into a character played by Mel Blanc, doing his Speedy Gonzales voice. To every question Benny asked, Blanc's character would provide similar sounding responses, answering all affirmatives with C, revealing his own name to be Cy, and that he had a sister named Sue, etc.
When, in the short, Judy's brother assures her that Alexander Phipps has no time to date babies, Tom quips,
He's not Jerry Seinfeld.
In 1993, 38-year-old Seinfeld was dating a 17-year-old high school senior, leaving many to ask, what's the deal with dating an underage girl? Seinfeld's sign fled any controversy, and to date, it seems the only way to sour audience goodwill from a 90s sitcom is to go on a racist tirade in public.
Tom's theme song is, of course, based on Carl Orff's famous O Fortuna from his Carmina Burana. These songs take their lyrics from a collection of saucy medieval poems written by anonymous Gauliards, which is to say theology students traveling from town to town trying to make a buck. The Orff piece has been used in countless films, a habit begun by the 1981 sword and sorcery classic Excalibur.
The Frank radio station sketches, with the salacious phrase, "turn your crank to Frank," owe their origins to the incredibly irritating ads for Bob 100 FM in Minneapolis, which launched the year before this episode aired. Each Bob ad featured a flock of pasty Minneapolites begging viewers to turn your knob to Bob and gushing that the station plays the most new country. Remember New Country? They had artists like Garth, Clint, Reba, Winona.
Other great new country stars on Frank: Green Acres' Pat Buttram, former Secretary General of the UN Dag Hammarskjöld, F-Troop comedian Larry Storch, Civil War General Stonewall Jackson, fashion designer Coco Chanel, tabloid talk show host Maury Povich, pen flautist Zamfir. Maybe New Country is more diverse than I thought.
Some of the other acts featured on Frank who aren't known as musicians have, in fact, put out albums, including eccentric Back to the Future actor Crispin Glover and Nancy Walker, who you might know as Ida Morgenstern from Rhoda, the Quicker Picker-Upper bounty paper towel spokesperson, or the director of the Village People's debut film, Can't Stop the Music. Links to some of their songs in the show notes.
Although TV's Frank claims that it's totally uncharacteristic to name a radio station Frank, in the early 2000s, several New England radio stations decided to do just that. Frank FMs used a format much like an MP3 player set on shuffle to play hundreds more songs in rotation than traditional radio, all pre-selected to reduce the need for on-air jockeys. So yeah, I guess the next time you're in Maine and jonesing for some classic hits, give it a listen? Or not.
And finally, as the girl gang goes to visit their fence, Sheila, Tom quips,
They have to pick up Mamie Van Doren.
That'd be hard.
Mamie Van Doren, of course, played bad girl turning good Silver in Girls Town, which Mike and the Bots had just watched a few episodes ago, but which we covered way back in episode 6. In fact, that was a good episode. I might put on my headphones, which we in the business call cans, and listen to that episode rather soon, as you should whenever your head is covered in a heavy set of cans.
And that's time. So, Adam, I might have a soft spot, maybe even a maybe even a squishy spot for this kind of short, which is like 50 shorts that are just absolutely enamored with technology.
Well, if you have a squishy spot, I hope you're handling it by yourself with something electric.
Oh, gross. Anyway, the favorite is Once Upon a Honeymoon, which is about phones.
Yeah, it's about phones, but boy, do you get lost in the story of Once Upon a Honeymoon.
And something similar seems to be happening here, where the point of the short, which is apparently how great appliances are, is really subsumed within this family story about teen courtship.
Yeah, this is not one of Jam Handy's finer efforts in terms of keeping the narrative straight, because it's very, like, I can totally understand. And I'm curious about this. Beth, were you confused when you first watched this, wondering what the hell this was about?
Yes.
Because it's partially a sex ed film, but it's also really a way to sell you a stove.
Yeah, really. It feels like it's about to become some kind of instruction video about how to court properly, because you have this randy teenage girl, Judy, who seems to be getting a little bit ahead of herself, and perhaps there'll be some kind of lesson about being, a proper lady and wearing your dress properly and all that stuff. But it's not. It's actually a hidden promotion for dishwashers.
Yeah, it's really, really bizarre, because it's a bit like watching a sitcom of the time where the in-character commercials, like say the Flintstones enjoying a Winston cigarette, have been edited into the narrative.
Right.
So it's really bizarre, because this honestly seems like a sitcom. Like, it might be a sex ed film, it might be a comedy, it might be a children's educational short about simply trying to let Judy down gently about a fellow who's just not interested because he'd rather talk about appliances. Or it might have something to do with the dad's desire to grow mushrooms that was tacked on at the end. Like, what the
Yeah, I have so much affection for this short. There's just so much weird stuff going on. But yes, Hired is another classic jam handy that stretches good salesmanship over like a 40-minute feature.
Yes, it's totally riveting as you see a man complain to his elderly father about dopey salesmen. And they're competently produced enough, and I want to say almost Hollywood enough that they're somewhat indistinguishable from television from the time. That's why it's so confusing, because the actors in this are fine. They're totally fine for what you would expect from, say, Leave It to Beaver. Like they're indistinguishable from Father Knows Best, and the same is true of Hired. Like the guys, the salesman, and the grumpy old dad who puts a handkerchief on his head. They're fine. Like they're totally adequate actors selling lines that don't really add up, but they manage to make them make sense through earnestness. And that may have been like the boon. That may have been like the selling point of a jam handy production, is that these were consumable as entertainment, or could be passed as entertainment to make the medicine of the commercial go down a little bit easier.
And the fact that like he's confident enough as a kind of sitcom actor to create interesting threads of character exposition, like the weird mushroom thing, and the fact that and the rivalry between the siblings, and it's just like, they've created a whole little universe here, haven't they? Where's the mother going off to? She's gallivanting around somewhere, and it's just like, they all have these little self-contained lives for selling dishwashers.
Handy was the Shakespeare of the 1950s short.
Right. And so should we mention Jam Handy? His actual name is Henry Jameson Handy. And
as if that's less ridiculous.
And he specialized in
handies.
Yes. And his philosophy was that good salesmanship should be about the salesperson connecting with their client, on an authentic level, and also being really passionate and very well informed about their own product. And that's what he tried to encourage in most of his shorts, was an awareness of the excellence of the product, how it was made. And you know what? I can get behind that. That is, I like the idea of salespeople being treated as professionals in their field. And I think what he's doing makes a lot of sense. It does lead to a little bit of a uncritical view of the things that are being sold, but that's what advertising is.
Exactly, that's what a salesman would encourage. And there is something that is really visible in terms of offering, I think, a kind of, maybe pizzazz is too strong of a word, but a certain polish on the kind of features that he made. Did you know that it was the Jam Handy organization that gave us Dinah Shore singing "See the USA" in your Chevrolet?
What? Oh, well, that's good work.
Yes, it's from a short called A Great New Star in 1952. And what's funny about that is, again, not to make this all about episodes that we're not covering, is, like, remember, that's the song that they threatened to sing but are ultimately cut off by commercial sign and copyright in Bride and the Monster.
My favorite segment by far was the opening when you come back from commercial and Mike is trying to pry the head off of Tom, the dummy head. And then it only comes off halfway, and Tom starts screaming and chasing Crow around, and it's pure chaos, and it's wonderful. It's one of my favorites.
I kept expecting him to recite the monologue from the infamous Trailers to Magic. But Beth, did you recognize the dummy head that Tom was sporting?
It was certainly a head I've seen before. I first thought, like, is that Howdy Doody? But Howdy Doody is even more grotesque. So this thing is apparently called Danny O'Day.
Yes, Danny O'Day, which I believe is the work of Jimmy Nelson, who also gave us Farfel. And what's weird is that I knew Farfel somehow. Like, Farfel was a cultural osmosis thing for me as a child, but Danny O'Day was not.
Yeah, and he became the mascot of Nestle chocolate. I guess Farfel did too.
Yes, because Farfel's the most famous part of that jingle, where, they sing a little bit about how, Nestle is good for you, blah, blah, blah. And then at the very end, the farful, saggy, droopy dog puppet goes, chocolate.
N-E-S-T-L-E-S, Nestle's makes the very best chocolate.
Which I knew, but I did not grow up with those ads or a variation on those ads.
Yeah, it's weird how open the culture was to ventriloquist dummies in the mid 20th century, because I don't think anybody can really stand them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The creep factor is just way too high. But it's fascinating in a way, because it just shows how much comedy and entertainment change. I studied Victorianism. Apparently, the funniest thing in the world to Victorians was telling jokes on the back of a horse. That's just how it was done. You couldn't tell jokes unless you were on stage on a horse.
that actually sounds pretty good.
Comedy especially seems to be something that is very culturally contingent. And so what we're seeing is something that was very popular in vaudeville. And that the remnants of vaudevillian comedy were kind of present in the culture, I'd say, until well into the 70s, when we got all of those variety shows. Then finally, all of those TV execs that were pushing that kind of died off. And we stopped getting so much puppetry and stuff that you get on the Ed Sullivan Show.
It's fascinating how much comedy and, just even light entertainment can seem surreal and bizarre.
So uncanny. I'm going to put up in the show notes a really good article from The Independent that talks about the weirdness of ventriloquist dummies. So you have these dummies who are usually adult men but child-sized, and the person who's controlling the dummy is called the vent, And he was talking about that weird dynamic where the vent is usually like the adult and their puppet is like this strange id. And in that way, that's what makes ventriloquists so creepy, is that it often seems to be an excuse to kind of let their darker instincts go to some extent through the puppet, a la Jeff Dunham.
Yes, that's a regular Jekyll and Hyde, the Jeff Dunham story.
Mm-hmm.
It's odd is that people tend to think of him as a more recent thing, but MST3K is a reminder that he was always with us, as he was a frequent butt of jokes on the show. And indeed, I can remember seeing him as a very young child on Just for Laughs, which played every hour on Canadian TV, Canadian Basic Cable. And it wasn't funny even as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that as early as I can think of, in terms of an example, people were commenting on the eeriness of dummies, because have you ever seen a famous 1945 anthology horror film called Dead of Night?
No.
Oh, man. Oh, man. Oh, man. So Dead of Night has a ventriloquist segment in which a man is terrified of his dummy. And sure enough, in one unbroken shot, we see the completely static dummy finally get up and walk towards its owner menacingly with the intent of killing him, which is still shocking. But in 1945 was fairly fresh ground. But it shows that they were already thinking, oh, this is weird and not good, this kind of performing.
So I'm just going to quote something from this Independent article about Edgar Bergen. He was the most celebrated vent at the time, as they call it. He made the dummy Charlie McCarthy. He's also the father of Candice Bergen, who has some odd stories about her relationship to the ventriloquist dummy Charlie. So here we go. She recalls Charlie's room in their Beverly Hills home, with its bed, wardrobe filled with monogram clothes, desk, West Point cadet's hat, feathered headdress, and pinup of Dorothy Lamour. Most creepy of all, then she says, for me, as a child, Charlie McCarthy had semi-human status. He wasn't flesh and blood, and he wasn't a doll either, but he was a sacred calf. He brought home the bacon. And most creepy of all, she recollects sitting on her father's knee, being encouraged to converse with the wooden brother perched opposite her.
Okay, this is alarmingly similar to the plot of the Canadian horror movie Pin, which I'm not just saying to shill a recent episode of a part of our Scaradage, which you can find at makeafunny.fm/scare. But that is a horrifying concept that has been exploited in fiction, both from the book by Andrew Niederman and the Canadian film of the same name, Pin. That's so terrifying that it seems like pure flight of fancy. And the fact that not just a seemingly well-adjusted person, but one of our most beloved stars grew up and mentally survived it. I mean, that's, wow. Candice Bergen is even stronger than Murphy Brown, it turns out. Well, I think I've gotten all the violence out of me. Chris, do you have a final factoid that would be a young man or young woman's fancy this morning?
I have a request for information from our clever listeners. Perhaps you noticed, as you were watching Young Man's Fancy, that when Judy finally sets out her very fancy dinner that will impress young Alex and win kudos from all the boys, that the scene opens with a close-up of the orange juice, freshly squeezed by the electric juicer, sitting in a glass on the middle of their plates.
Yeah, I noticed that creepy too. What is that?
Is it a dummy?
I've spent the last few days Googling for images of 1950s place settings to see if I could find anyone who had ever done this ever, because it seems like the most awkward and ugly way of presenting juice. And I didn't find anything at all. So if anyone out there has any insight as to why the hell anyone would ever do this, please write in.
Can I throw in a theory?
Sure, please do.
So they're treating it as a soup course.
Oh, okay.
Because, there was never any reason to present a liquid before unless it was soup. But now you've got this new thing that creates, fresh squeezed juice that needs to be presented on its own instead of something that is off to the side, as you usually do with, water or wine or whatever. So you treat it as a soup course.
I wonder if there's an article in Good Housekeeping suggesting this as an exciting new way to zhuzh up your dinner table.
Well, I might have some old Weight Watchers cards. I'll go through them.
Yes, and indeed, if any of you find a write-up on this, please send us le mot jus on this.
If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you've ever put orange juice on a plate, or if you'd like to ask Beth and Adam anything, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com, and we're on Twitter at itisjustashow. We'd love to hear from you. The show is made possible by listeners like you. For as little as $1 an episode, you can help us research and record this show, and you can listen to all our superfan bonus bits, bloopers, chit-chat, entire segments that sometimes just don't make the edit for time, but which are still fun enough to share. You can find out more at itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. Thank you if you do. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/50.
Well, Chris, our squishiness has been squeezed out. What's happening for us next time?
Well, you might remember Adam in the Shallow 13 mentioned our favorite Vavavoomstress, Mamie Van Doren. And since we've been looking at Girls Gone Bad movies, we should probably check back in on her, eh? So let's take a look at another Van Doren vehicle, Season 1, Episode 12, Untamed Youth.
Haven't seen this one.
Yeah, let's hear it for the MVD, the most valuable Doran.
Do like her, don't tend to like the first season.
I don't know, Robot Monster proved to be a smash success.
Well, it proved to be a good movie. I don't know about the rest.
It was a great episode, too. It was super funny.
Yeah, and you like Crawling Eye as well.
It's true.
So the two that we've done, you've enjoyed.
All right. Still skeptical.
Let's see if we can bowl a turkey. Get 3 in a row. Well, on that note,
if squishy symptoms remain, please consult your doctor.
Don't forget, vandalism doesn't have to lead to murder. It can just lead to more vandalism.
Or communism. Take it away, Theme Squad.